All right, so the next one is going to be talking about signalers and receivers. And so we're going to look at those basic structures a little bit closer with some examples. So when you're signaling, there's honest signals. And the honest signal is, what it means is I'm sending a signal that is honest. I don't know, sometimes life's not hard, I guess. But what it is it gives you a true sense of my health, my worth. And so what'll happen maybe in the picture on the left, that is a ptarmigan, a bird, but you know, he looks a little scruffy, and you might think, okay, maybe not healthy, maybe some parasites. You know, maybe I want to pick a nicer looking male, a little bit more color. This is probably breeding season, and not breeding season. This is probably molting season, and you know, he's not looking his best. On the right is toads. They'll mention the male snout to vent length. The larger toads are the ones that are more likely for the females to mate with. And so what happens with these guys is the larger toads actually have a lower frequency of sound. They have a deeper call. And so what this does for them, and it's not something they can fake. It's hard for a smaller toad to make that deep a sound. So this would be an honest signal to females. If they can't see them and they have this very loud, low call, it's probably a larger toad and one they would be more likely to want to breed with. Another honest signal is begging. And so what happens with baby birds, just in general, is the parents come up with food, and who gets to eat is usually the one that's most aggressive and the loudest. And so the parents aren't really going, oh, you know, Bob got fed this time, we got to give Mary some food this time. It's who's ever dancing around the most. So the loudest calls are really the ones that are getting fed, but the problem with that is if they're too loud, that'll bring on predators and everybody loses. And so that becomes a problem. So there is a level of noise that these birds will make that they tend to try not to exceed, because if they do exceed that sound, they get taken out, and then that behavior gets eliminated out of the gene pool. So I want to talk about European cuckoos, and we have a cuckoo here as our roadrunner, but we also have a bird that does this, which are cowbirds. This one just happened to be done in Europe. What they do is they lay their nests, and we'll talk about that when we do reproduction. But they lay their eggs in other birds' nests. And so the cuckoos do this, and they tend to be a bit bigger than the parasitized birds. And so what happens is when the parents get to the nest, what they see is this very large baby with his mouth open most of the time. And so what happens, it tricks the parents into feeding. It's kind of that fixed action pattern. The big wide open mouth is what you put the food in. And so, you know, we're thinking honest signals is the more you're screaming, the more food you need. And so number of feedings per hour is, it turns out the cuckoos get quite a bit. All right, and then let's talk about receivers, illegitimate receivers. The Tungara frog does a wine chuck sound is its normal breeding call. And that's what the females like. And so unfortunately, you know, if I'm a big male and I'm doing my wine chuck, you know, females will come up. But actually, there's a species that eat these frogs that have figured out that call is what they do, so they hone in on it. And so what you see is the signaler is the Tungara frog, and he's putting out an honest signal. The problem is there is an illegitimate receiver, and that is the bat. So what happens with these frogs, when these bats are in the area, they don't do the chuck. That's the sound that the bats are actually keying in on. So they switch over to just the whine noise. So this is one of these races for survival, and we'll talk about with predator prey, is kind of conditioning yourselves. Other illegitimate receivers, mobbing calls. So we have a hawk, and what you'll see is, we want to get this hawk out of the way. And so what'll happen, and here they have a sparrowhawk, and they have these great tits. The mobbing call they'll make some noises to get other birds to come up and just annoy them. They can't hurt them, but just annoy them out of the direction. And so they're usually above. They're a little more maneuverable, so they can kind of dive in and stay out of the way for the most part. Occasionally they get nabbed, but to harass them. But what happens also is they find out that the regular calls on these birds will bring in the hawk. So they have what's called a seat call. It's a lower range pitch, and you'll see birders do it all the time. It's a sound of psh, 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 psh. And that's typically stays underneath the hawk's hearing when they're up above. And that kind of is a warning sound. And birders will actually use this. If you are walking through an area, I've done it where you're trying to see if a bird is there. If you do that call, often you'll get a bird kind of hop up a little bit to take a look to see where the predator is. And that way you can see the bird. So called a seat call. And here's an illegitimate signaler. So these are pretty cool. These are fireflies. And what happens is they flash light to attract a mate. So the female, what it will do is typically do, different species will do different numbers of flashes and different patterns. So what you'll see is a female will signal a male and to be bred. And then when she does that and gets impregnated, what they often will do is then flip over. And they call them femme fatales, because what they'll do is they will do a neighboring flash. In other words, a different species flash to bring in that male, not as a breeder, but as a potential food source. And so they're called femme fatales. And pretty cool. So we got liars out here. So these are, okay, so be careful. Illegitimate receivers versus an illegitimate signaler. And I think I said receiver at the beginning. And I even do that. So be real careful on quizzes and tests how you do that. So this is an illegitimate signaler. And then the anglerfish, if you watched Finding Nemo, because I know you learn all your biology from Disney. But the anglerfish, which has that little light on the out, they're in pretty much total darkness, but they have this little light out in front, and they hang it out there, and they're signaling, other fish and things to come up, so then they become food. And we will end the recording.